Welcome to episode 47 of the Headspace and Timing podcast, a show dedicated to changing the way that you think about veteran mental health, brought to you by the Change Your POV podcast network. We're doing something a little different with this episode. I've heard from readers of the Headspace and Timing blog that they'd like to come on the show and talk about something that we put out. So once a month, we're going to take some time to talk to a friend of the blog and show about a post they connected with. Today's guest is Rhiannon Guzelian, an Air Force officer and veteran advocate who's dedicated to bringing the topic of veteran mental health into the wider conversation. Rhiannon and I are going to talk about a blog post called Veterans, Why So Serious, which I'm going to link to the show notes, which you can find at changeyourpov.com or veteranmentalhealth.com.
I would really attribute my being alive today to having an excellent counselor in the mindset that you get in sometimes with depression. You're not thinking rationally. So my family who loved me, I didn't believe that they could possibly love me. My husband, who is super caring, I thought that I didn't deserve him. So when I'm in that low place, it really took an outside person who was this trusted mental health professional that I had to bring my attention to the really the falsehoods that I was buying into, the things that I was believing that were untrue. So even if you have a lovely and supportive family like I do, for me, in the mindset that my depression gets me in, I can't believe them. So I think that I really credit her with saving my life and keeping me accountable for how I'm feeling.
Welcome to the Change Your POV podcast network. You're listening to Headspace and Timing, a show dedicated to breaking down the stereotypes about veteran mental health. My name's Dwayne France, and I'm a combat veteran of both Iraq and Afghanistan. After I retired from the Army, I took on a new mission as a clinical mental health counselor for my fellow service members. If you served in any branch of the military, you're familiar with the M2 machine gun, the 50 cal. It's one of the most effective weapons in the military's arsenal. If the weapon's headspace and timing wasn't set right, however, it was just a huge useless chunk of metal. Veterans can be rendered inoperable if their headspace and timing isn't set correctly either. That's my goal with this show, to change the way that we think and talk about veteran mental health and reduce the stigma against seeking support. Each week, we'll talk with mental health professionals, veterans, and those who support veterans, service members, and their families. We're going to have real and honest conversations about a topic that most just don't like to talk about, veteran mental health. Let's jump into this week's conversation. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Headspace and Timing podcast. Once again, and as always, I really appreciate you taking your time to check out this show and all the shows talking about veteran mental health. We know there's a lot of different things you could be doing with your time. There's a lot of different things you could be listening to, and the fact that you're listening to this means a lot to us and means a lot to the Change Your POV podcast network. So we often have on mental health professionals talking about what they're doing with regarding mental health for veterans, and we often have on veterans who sort of want to talk about their own experience with their mental health journey. And this show falls into that really second category. But this is also a show about a little bit more about the Headspace and Timing blog. So I wanted to start bringing on some friends of the show and friends of the blog. I hear a lot from readers and listeners about some of the things that we're doing, and I figured I'd like to share that with the audience. So today, I've got a veteran. Her name is Rhi Guzelian, and Rhi is former Air Force, right, Rhi?
That's correct.
Yep. So Rhi is coming on the show to talk a little bit about some of the stuff and then some of her experiences. So Rhi, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me on. I've been a little bit of a fangirl. I follow you on Twitter. And I've been listening to the podcast, following the blog for a little bit, and I just really appreciate the work that you're doing and relaying, the resources that are out there and the reasons that folks should access them.
That's great. I'm not going to be so self-deprecating as to now I have 3 listeners, you, my wife, and my mother, because I know we have a little bit more than that. But
that's a fan club.
It is a fan club. We're anywhere, we're 3. But no, I appreciate it, and I appreciate even the response and reaching out. But before we get into a little bit of that, I'd like to have you tell the audience a little bit about maybe your background and your experiences.
For sure. So I was an Air Force brat, and when it came time to pick my branch of service, I went with the devil that I knew, which was the Air Force. I joined ROTC at Boston University and did 4 years of training with them, commissioned in 2007. Right before I commissioned, I had a spot for Intel School at Goodfellow in Texas, and my commander came to me and said, "Hey, would you like to be an air battle manager?" And I said, "What's that?" It turned out there was a critical shortage in the field, and I decided that I would give it a shot. I called my dad first. He is always my consultant on military things, and he said, "Well, if you go that route, you'll get crew rest, which is where you're forced to sleep. You'll have the best accommodations. I say, go for it." So I took his advice. I leaned into it and never looked back. So they changed my my tech school date and moved it to October. I graduated, had a summer of kind of just fun employment, and then I went to Alabama for my initial training. So after that, I did tech school in Tyndall Air Force Base, Florida. I went to the undergraduate air battle management training course. Graduated from that course in 2009 and moved to Robbins Air Force Base, Georgia, which is the home of a lot of things. There are many commands there, but my platform was the E-8C Joint Stars. And I went through my initial training there, went to the 12th Airborne Command and Control Squadron, and from there I deployed 3 times in support of Operations Enduring Freedom, Iraqi Freedom, and New Dawn in staff positions, on crews, and after that became an instructor at the schoolhouse down in Tyndall that had trained me, and I got out of the military in 2014 in September. I knew that I wanted to help veterans find employment, and I didn't know that there were people that got paid to do that. So as soon as I found that out, I applied for a job at the state of Maine as a Disabled Veterans Outreach Program Specialist, and I worked there for about a year and a half. I got scooped up from there to go to Easter Seals, Maine, as they stood up their homeless veterans reintegration program. And I've been doing that for the last year and 8 months. And I just left that position to pivot into a different field. So that's the bio, the stuff that you would put on the internet. And I also have my own mental health journey in that, which I'm not sure if you want to start now or get into a little bit later.
Well, and it was and as I was listening to that, that's exactly it. There's these stories that we tell everyone, and it sounds pretty neat, right? It's hua awesome. I mean, and even just to and people say Air Force deploys. Well, of course they deploy, and you've had 3 deployments. There's a lot of information to pack into 7 years and kind of sum it up into 3 to 5 minutes. And if that is the only face that we show the world, then everybody would say, well, of course, she doesn't have any problems. There's no concerns there. So why get on a veteran mental health podcast then?
I think that it's exactly that reason, which is I found myself in a position where I was helping others, specifically, my fellow veterans, which was a dream come true for me. It was exactly what I wanted. And I basically had the one face that I was showing someone else where I'm an authority in this topic, and I've been there and I've done this, and if you listen to me, you're going to get a job. But there's an underlying current when you're looking for job search of incredible vulnerability, and a lot of information starts coming out about people's struggles during job search. And one of the things that was tough to me was maintaining that professional boundary, where I had issues with PTSD, depression, anxiety, and I knew what they were going through more than I was able to let them know. And that felt a little bit stifling. So when you're there in the service of another person. You only disclose if it's, in the service of that person. But there were a lot of times that I wished I could just take off my badge and say, hey, you're not alone. You're not alone in your struggle, and recovery is possible. So that's why I like to come on. And I love talking about mental health. And I kind of made a decision about 6 months ago that I was prepared to tell my story, and that I was prepared to accept the risk of that. So if there's stigma, if there's consequences for sharing the story, I'm okay with that. And I'm able to do that because I'm supported, and I have a great network.
No, and that I think is very clear. And as you said, that's really the goal of this show, and then the blog is to say that we're not either one or the other. We're not these awesome high tech, high flying Air Force officers or these growl pound. I mean, we are that is a portion of who we are. And we also have challenges related to our military service, combat, non-combat, and things like that. It doesn't mean we're one or the other. It means that we're both. And then putting those two things together and getting help means that we become a better version of ourselves. And I think that's a lot of some of the feedback that I've gotten is, oh, you're perpetuating a stereotype, right? You're perpetuating the stereotype of the broken warrior. Whereas this is a very complicated issue.
Absolutely.
It's not that we're broken warriors. It's that we are warriors. And we have challenges. Both those things are true.
That's 100% true. And I just my experiences in my first year and a half working with veterans on employment, I started to feel more and more that the issues that held folks back from employment, whether they be health, mental health, sometimes poverty, sometimes homelessness, whatever those barriers were, they were not veteran issues, they were human issues. And I started to really look at veterans as humans before anything else. And it sounds almost very obvious to say, but the things that we face are things that they exist in society as a whole. We don't have a monopoly on them. And I think the more that we open up and tell our stories, the more normalizing it becomes. And I think the more it can close that gap between what's called the military-civilian divide.
No, I think that's absolutely true. Many times people will look at me, and even hearing your bio there, they say, well, of course, she's high flying, she's hardcore, she's good at what she does, she is a veteran. And so either she doesn't have any problems, or the other side of the label, that you're a hero, or that you're broken, that you're, just because you deployed, that you have something wrong. I think I've said it before on the show, but I actually had a colleague, a psychologist, as a matter of fact, who works with veterans. We were talking, and she asked me how many deployments I had, and I said, I had 5. And she said, well, of course you have PTSD. And I said, 2 of those deployments, the latrine was in the same building I slept in, so they weren't really hard deployments. So let's not jump to conclusion that automatically I was hanging off the side of a cliff. And there were 2 challenging deployments, sure, but so trying to break down that sort of automatic assumption, it's very critical.
It really is. And I had an interesting experience when I finally did seek help from a counselor, a private counselor, once I got out of the military. And she, did the initial intake paperwork, and in order to charge insurance, they have to have a diagnosis, of course. So she shared my diagnoses with me, partly as a way of validation. And they were anxiety, which didn't surprise me. I said, okay, depression, which made an awful lot of sense for the amount of crying that I was doing and the amount of nothing that I was doing. And then the third one was PTSD, and I pushed back pretty hard on that one because I have friends who have PTSD and came to it through combat trauma. And so for me, that was what PTSD meant. So I couldn't embrace that, and it took me about 4 or 5 months to finally come to terms with it, observing the effects of it in my own life. But yeah, the assumption that, well, you're a veteran, you deployed, you probably have PTSD is A, a false assumption, and B, you can have PTSD from things that are completely unrelated to deployment.
Yes, I mean, and that's exactly true, and that's one of the reasons why when you reached out and kind of told me a little bit of your story, I definitely even more wanted to get you on the show to be able to talk about that, and it's to kind of break down that stigma. Before we get into that, though, of course, this is
Sure.
this is all very serious. Serious topic, serious subject,
Very
but
serious.
one of the blog posts that you wanted to talk about was one of my most recent ones talking about why are we so serious. I'm a
Yes.
I am a combat veteran mental health counselor. I carry the weight of trauma around, and it's so very serious. But I wrote that post because if we are so serious all the time, then it can be a pretty big burden. And I'm going to link to that post in the show notes. But I'd like to hear sort of your take on that blog post.
Absolutely. I was so tickled when I read just the title of it that I, of course, had to finish reading the blog. And what I loved about it was that it's so true. The people with the best senses of humor that I know in my life, and again, I'm going to paint with a broad brush, are the veterans in my life and the first responders in my life. And they've got such an excellent sense of humor that sometimes when it comes to what we talk about publicly about our experience as veterans tends towards a lot of solemnity, which I do understand. It tends toward, occasional indignation, which I also understand in certain circumstances. But the piece we leave out is just the hilarious things that happen as a byproduct of serving the military. And that's not all things that happen when deployed, although I loved your story about the goats.
Yeah, I mean, the thing, let me, and listeners, again, if you haven't read this, but I'll talk a little bit about it. I was on patrol. I was escorting, I believe, some local national vehicles, and we were, I don't know, regardless of what we were doing while we were there, and we were driving through Jalalabad, and there was this minivan, and the minivan had two goats tied to the roof. Now, if you are a veteran and you are in, if you deployed to Iraq or Afghanistan, this is a typical way that people transport livestock. If you're not in the military, then you don't recognize that this is something, and this is going to be weird to you. But as we're driving, I'm sitting there, I'm staring at these goats, and then my driver, hits her horn or something like that, and then the goat lifted up its head and looked at me and freaked me out, right? I mean, it's and we see that kind of stuff, right, while we're deployed, and those are the easy stories to tell, but we can think back on our military service and think about those dumb memories to really counterbalance some of the harder ones.
Absolutely, and accounting for both, I think, is really crucial in integrating the experience as a whole. We tend to focus on the real serious stuff, or the stuff that sticks with us, and we didn't ask it to stick with us. But accounting for the humor, both the humor of our coworkers and the humorous experiences that we went through, I think is a super just a nice way to balance that out. And it's not going to get rid of any of the tough memories, but it's going to supply kind of a fuller picture. And I think the more that you practice humor, the more it's accessible to you as a coping mechanism. And I could probably, if I were to be assessed in this way, I think that maybe I relied too heavily on humor as a coping mechanism, to the detriment and atrophy of some other coping mechanisms, but it's never hurt me. So I'm a big fan of exercising that humor muscle, and I loved some of your suggestions in the article for how to do that, in terms of watching something silly, something that is maybe a little bit absurd or a little bit funny, right down to some cartoons. I have a couple of programs that I watch that are effectively that, me checking out of my head and allowing myself to kind of venture through this absurdist landscape a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, and there's really nothing wrong with it, right? We don't have to be so heavy, so serious all the time. Maybe you might not be a Monty Python fan, but I am, and I can't really be in a bad mood if I'm watching Monty Python and the Holy Grail, right? I mean, it's just so dumb, or and I think in there, I'm a big fan of old Marx Brothers movies, and I've got all the movies saved, and it's one of those things. It's one of the things that we teach in mental health counseling is if you're feeling a certain way, watch something or do something that causes a different emotion. If you're angry,
Yes.
don't watch something that makes you angry. Watch something that makes you laugh, or even makes you watch something scary, right? Make something that, but watch something or do something that takes you out of the emotion you're in and gets you into a different emotion, and then you're able to go back and work on that.
Exactly. There's a transportational power, I think, to comedy. And comedy has been a really important part in, me separating from the military too, in terms of just really enjoying Parks and Recreation is the one I have to throw out there. That ended just as my military service was ending. And it's the one show that I will watch every single week when it was on. And it's just such a positive show. It makes fun of itself, but it doesn't really, it's good-natured. And it's something that I really, really enjoy. But, we all have such ridiculous experiences while we're in, from, I loved your example of having a meeting to prepare for meetings that were just to prepare for other meetings.
Mm-hmm. And that happens in the civilian world too. And that's something that veterans are very, very familiar with. But yeah.
Exactly. I loved that, and it made me kind of think of some funny experiences from when I was in the military. And it's funny because when you put yourself on the spot to think about it, it's a little difficult, but there are really so many to pick from. I thought of one, which was from one of my deployments in support of OEF, and there was just a really bad radio reception day. And so the unit that was controlling the airspace asked us to do some radio relays for them, because our platform had a communication suite that was able to kind of complement theirs. And so I did about 36 radio relays from them. And there was a lovely controller at the combined unit that was controlling the airspace, who was super polite. He was British, and they're the most polite controllers known to man. Every time I would relay something for him, he would say, "Thanks a million." And so I counted, and at the end of the mission, he had thanked me 36 million times. But they're just silly things that, in the moment, it's just happening, and it just kind of might make you smile. And then later when you look back on it, it'll make you chuckle.
Yeah, and those are the points that, again, if we're always focusing on or looking at, these heavy, heavy subjects, that we can get lost in that, and we can kind of wander around in the dark places in the woods, rather than, getting pulled out of that for whatever reason. It's and as I've often said here on the podcast, and this is an audio podcast, so you can't really see it. Maybe I'll do a video one sometime. But my office looks like a retired first sergeant's office. I got maps on the walls and my guide on, and so it's a little bit more military than what someone would think of a typical therapist's office. But I've got a nice table with my coins inside. And anybody who has served in the military knows that these coins are each a story. They represent a story. And I'll actually use that with veterans if we're dealing with something particularly hairy or something like that. Then, closer to the end of the session, I'll say, "Hey, pick out a coin, and I'll tell you a story." And it's usually a dumb story, and it's usually something that, getting caught playing Monopoly at NTC by a 1-star general or something like that. And it's something to really break the ice and remind us that there is a life of joy possible beyond just this kind of stress life.
I really love the word you chose there, joy, because to me, humor is a big access point to joy. There's a lot of things that I find joyful. And when I'm in the depths of maybe depression, or I'm very stressed about something that's going on, it's a little bit difficult to access joy as this kind of raw, really positive feeling. But I think that the humor is a little bit of a connector to that. And the other reason I'm so glad you said joy is that one of the things that I'm learning to apply in my own life is that joy and pain are not mutually exclusive. And they're things that we can identify happening at the same time in our lives. And I think that there's a tendency for us to want to gravitate towards the pain because it's overwhelming sometimes. And when pain overwhelms, you're not looking for the joy that's out there. And I'm not talking about counting your blessings. I'm talking about individual moments of joy that might crop up wherever they are. Your dog coming up to, rest his head on your knee, or the way the light is coming through the trees if you're an appreciator of light the way I am. I think that humor is a great access point to that feeling of momentary joy and appreciation.
And I think that's a critical point, is that joy is possible in spite of, and many times even because of, the things that have happened to us. Some really great things happen to us, some really horrible things happen to us. We've done really great things and we've done really horrible things. And so a lot of people will say, okay, there's just this stuck point, and that this, and we can enjoy the suck, right? That's the thing, especially as us ground pounders are, embrace the stuck, and I love this suck so much. And so yeah, there's some element of that, in actually enjoying a 12 or 14 mile ruck march, but we don't enjoy the pain. We don't enjoy dredging up these memories of these things. But there's a way, in thinking that they're so painful, we avoid approaching them, and therefore we rob ourselves of the joy that's on the other side of them, and how you were saying that recovery is possible. As I said in the blog post, we do life, but are we truly enjoying life? Post-military life isn't meant to suck. It's meant to be appreciated.
It's exactly, and I think that the period of transition that you go through, which we think of as 2 to 5 years, but really it can take a decade to really transition. It can take longer. It's different for everybody. And it's all normal. It all depends on what your circumstances are. But that period of transition, you're kind of waiting for, all right, I'm going to come out the other side, and I'm going to suddenly be myself. I'm going to be this new identity. I'm going to be happy. And that puts an awful lot of pressure on the future and not a lot of attention on the now. And what I'm learning is that what's effective for me is to notice moments of joy now, and as I notice them, file them away in my brain, to say, all right, I want more of this. So if I want to see more of like beautiful light streaming through trees, maybe I need to be outdoors more. And I'm using it as kind of a happy pinpoint that I can take and use that information and that data to contribute to a more joyful future, and also to help assess my values. All right, for this long in my life, I've valued X, Y, and Z. At this point, what do I value now? And taking a real assessment, taking stock of your values, and giving yourself a chance to live in accordance with them, I think is really, for me, the hallmark of like a successful transition. You've identified your values and what's important to you now, and you're living by them.
No, and I think that's a really great observation. I mean, there is a shift. There's a shift in our mindset. We think, I'll be so glad that I no longer have to stand in formation. And here's my Air Force joke, whereas a formation is where a group of people stand in one place at one time. I know Air Force doesn't do formation so much, but
no.
But you don't want to have to, I'm so glad that I don't have to wear the uniform, and I'll be so happy when I'm not. And then when you don't, because I live close to a military base, Fort Carson, as I go walk my dogs in the morning, I'll listen to, Reveille go up and the sound of the cannon, and I'll look back on that things that I was so happy to get away from, and I kind of almost wish I was there a little bit.
Yes.
And so making that shift to say, okay, that was that in my place in that life, and this is my place in this life, and not trying to hold on to that. That's a really good way of looking at making the transition. The transition is as much psychological, and it is mostly psychological in my opinion, rather than just getting a job and having something else to do with your life.
Exactly. And speaking of getting a job, that's been my work for the last 3 years. So the reason that I decided to go into the veterans employment space was I decided a couple of years before I left the military. I've been doing a lot of reading. I've been staying up on a lot of veteran issues and the issue of veteran unemployment. And something that frightened me was a possible return to what the they called in World War II, or excuse me, World War One, Ernest Hemingway talked about a lost generation. So a generation of folks that went away to war, came back, and the skills that they had acquired for war, as you would say, weren't serving them in this new circumstance, and they weren't able to take on gainful employment. So, technical industry, the trades were missing workers in that age demographic because of effectively their new kind of mindset and their inability to grab these new skills. And I was a little bit worried about the possibility that might happen with our generation. We're a generation that's been at war for well over a decade, and our youth have been bearing the brunt of that. So I thought, what is a great way to get people integrated, get them a renewed sense of purpose? It's employment. So I chose employment as the sector that I wanted to go into. I don't have a degree in mental health counseling, although I'm very interested in mental health. And I got my job at the state, and what I began to find was that when someone comes to you saying, help me find a job, often they're saying, I have a problem in my life that I want to fix by getting a job. It's not just the job, but it's the job that is the aspirational way or the practical way of approaching solving this problem.
Well, and that's what we're told as we leave the military, is the solution. And obviously, the solution to paying the bills is getting a job, but that's the idea that if you get a job, then you'll be okay, and yes. that is the solution, where there's underlying concerns that may or may not make that true. I really appreciate how you brought out that the idea of the World War I generation. I've written before about how I think that veterans such as you and I and those of our generation, that we have the potential to be this century's greatest generation. Yes. That just as the post-World War II generation was a lot of the economic and political and social driving aspects of that generation, that we have the potential to be the same for this century. We don't have the same numbers, but we have platforms such as this to amplify our voice. Yes. Equally, potentially, however, we have the ability to become the post-World War I generation. And so we're standing at this crossroads of, are we going to be a generation that is lost and a generation that is unfocused, or are we actually going to be a generation that's actually going to take hold of the future and get involved, and I'm beginning to think that we have that actually both are going to be true, that there's going to be a segment of veterans that do become lost, and there's going to be a segment of veterans that are going to say, screw that, I'm not going to go that way, and make a difference, and I think that's very tragic that split is occurring, maybe, or is going to occur.
I would say that I fully agree with your assessment, and that the way that we can tip the balance towards there being a greater segment of folks in the greatest generation category and a smaller segment of folks who are lost is by normalizing mental health treatment. I'm by no means saying that every person that I met for job search, would benefit from seeing a mental health counselor, but I would say that a lot of the things that make it difficult for us to get and keep a job would be very, I won't say easily, but readily fixed by somebody who is a professional mental health counselor. And those are things from stress tolerance to attention issues, to identifying triggers and choosing a workplace that doesn't leave you constantly on edge. There are a lot of things that are self-knowledge that a counselor can help you arrive at, that an employment counselor alone is probably not going to dig in and do that work with you. So I do think that what you're doing in normalizing veteran mental health in all of its, shapes and forms and degrees is going to help those folks who may be tending towards feeling lost.
And that's exactly true. I am not someone who is going to help you get a job. I am someone who's going to help you get the job. I mean, not in the way I'm
Yes.
going to help you with the resume, but I'm going to help you become more aware of your tendencies to do different things, so that you have the ability to go out and get that job, or be comfortable in the workforce, or make that transition. As you said before, that transitioning in awareness, it can either happen by yourself, or it can happen with the support of other people. And mental health professionals are uniquely qualified to be able to do that. I often tell my clients, I'm not an answering machine, right? You can go to
Right.
Google and you can type in the question that you have, and Google will give you the answer. But I'm more like a mirror. I hear what you tell me, and I reflect back to you what I'm hearing you say. And that may raise a level of awareness in you, and that may say, you know what, I didn't realize that the reason I don't like the full moon is because, every time we had, full moonlight in Afghanistan was I got attacked. So there's this, it's a way to help generate that and say, what, do I want to believe that? That was true
Right.
then. Do I want to continue to believe that now? And I can actually control what I choose to pay attention to. And that's where mental health counseling can really help a veteran put some of these things to rest. Was that how it was for you?
It was. So one of my biggest frustrations with, I have a really easy counseling story, which is that the first counselor that I hired was the one that I'm still with now. And I understand that's kind of a unicorn scenario when it comes to finding a therapist. But one of my frustrations with my therapist is when I ask her a question or what I should do, and she won't give me an answer. She makes me work through it and helps guide me through it. So the thing that she helped make me aware of was really my triggers. And having awareness around my triggers immediately made those triggers first feel smaller, and also made me aware of what was happening in my mind and in my body when I was approached by those triggers or when I encountered those triggers. So for me, that was a really enlightening experience, and it was one that, due to where my head was at, I could never have done in a self-guided way. So really having this external sounding board and somebody who is trained to listen and really listen was invaluable to me. So for example, one of my triggers was anytime I felt trapped. I would go into kind of a full-blown panic, the body sweats, the feeling dizzy, tunnel vision, all of that. And a couple of those pain points for me were the checkout at the grocery store when somebody comes up behind you in line and you're literally trapped, or being stuck in traffic. And the fact that she named those two things made me much more aware of what my options were in that scenario. I could either recognize, okay, you're in line at the grocery store and someone's behind you. You're stuck here, but if you really needed to get out, you could. Or being in traffic, just being aware of what was going on and knowing that I had an option potentially to, pull over and just take a second, was really, really empowering for me because I no longer felt helpless in those scenarios.
That goes to a lot of veterans. I think I see that try to manage their environment. That they try to control the environment rather than controlling the way that we react to the environment. And so I could see someone who hadn't, gone to, a counselor and identified that, they would avoid driving.
Yes.
Or they would avoid going to, they would use self-checkout, or they would, go to extreme lengths to not put themselves in that situation,
Absolutely.
because that they weren't aware of that, versus trying to control me in the environment. I am not a fan of the, please don't use fireworks because a veteran lives here. We didn't do
Yes.
that when we were in the military. We didn't require the environment to adapt to us. We adapted ourselves to the environment. And somehow we think that now once we get out, we have to require everyone else to modify how they live their lives to be able to make us feel better. Where, as you know, and many people know, we cannot control anyone or anything outside of ourselves. We have the ability to make those adjustments within ourselves, and that's it.
Yes, there was so much liberty to me in learning that concept, the concept a little bit of self-management and just the awareness of what is going to set me off. So I've been with my therapist for 3 years. And I've also gone through 3 bouts of intensive outpatient therapy because my depression does tend towards suicidal ideation, which is not a fun place to be, and it's not the safest place to be. So I was able to identify through going through these IOP programs that one of my triggers was incongruence in the face of injustice. So when somebody had wronged, usually one of my veterans, having to, politely smile and shake their hand to preserve their relationship really upset me. So it was something that learning that there is injustice and you can say your piece in the face of it, but you cannot change what the other person thinks or believes. That was really eye-opening for me. And it took 3 times of the same type of problem for me to finally embrace that I can say my piece, I can be congruent, I can share my beliefs and the facts around the situation, and beyond that, what happens is not within my control, and that's okay.
And I think that's a big thing of giving up that control is not something that's comfortable for veterans. I mean,
No.
of course, there were things that were not in our control. When you were, in the aircraft or you were in, doing what you were doing or anybody in any situation, you don't have control. And then when we get out, we feel as though we need that control, but it doesn't always work, and we can kind of implement that control within ourselves. In the idea of and you've really touched on them here, employment as a problem for veterans, suicide. We know about the epidemic of veteran suicides, and then you said you worked with homeless veterans for a period of time.
Yes.
These are all big problems that people want to solve, but I don't see them as problems. I see them as indicators of the deeper problem, the core problem, which is unaddressed and undiagnosed mental health. And it's not saying that veterans are broken, but we go through unique challenges, unique situations in our military career that others don't go through, and that leads to struggles with housing, employment, and suicide. So we're not going to, in my opinion, solve the veteran suicide problem or the veteran unemployment problem or the veteran homeless problem until and unless we address the veteran mental health problem and help the veterans get to those places on their own. What do you think about that?
I truly, truly believe that. And when we talk about mental health, too, we talk a lot about some issues that people might want to distance themselves from. Maybe somebody doesn't want to look at a PTSD diagnosis. Maybe they don't want to talk to a counselor because they're concerned that a diagnosis would preclude them from using firearms. There's a lot of unique barriers, I think, in the veteran community to accessing mental health. But it doesn't always have to be for PTSD or depression or anxiety. The stress of military transition alone is problematic in a lot of people's lives. And I think that approaching it as bringing someone onto your team to help you solve these problems or challenges, they're not even problems, is super crucial. So I would urge people, even if they're not reaching a point where they can't get out of bed, like I couldn't get out of bed, they can barely leave the house, going out in public puts them into a panic. Even if you're not at that point, you can absolutely benefit from bringing somebody on your team to talk through the stresses of transition. We had a conference last summer, and we had a briefer, a doctor from home base in Boston, come up and discuss transition stress versus PTSD, and the symptomology was all identical with 2 exceptions, which were flashbacks and nightmares, which means that all of those other symptoms you can have during transition stress. That's a lot. That's a lot to handle on your own. So I would really urge someone who maybe doesn't suspect that they have a mental health issue, but does need some help sorting things out, to reach out and find a confidant, a counselor, somebody that you can really trust to help you work through those concerns.
Man, and I didn't even pay you to say any of that. None of that was. I mean, it's
you
not.
can Venmo me later.
Yeah, but that's exactly right. I mean, we focus on these conditions, and I'll provide a link to the Veteran Mental Health Boot Camp. It's that series of podcast episodes that I did. I think it's starting with episode 25, and it's looking at all of this. That yes, there is the diagnosis, the things that are in the book: PTSD, traumatic brain injury, substance abuse, and emotional dysregulation, depression, anxiety, and things like that. Those are all things that are able to be diagnosed. Those are all things that have a medication that can work in many ways, or doesn't work in some other ways. They're all things that the insurance pays for, and they're all things that the VA pays for disability. But then there are the other factors that what you're talking about: transition stress, lack of purpose and meaning. I'm no longer doing what I used to do, and it doesn't feel as important now as I did before. Moral injury, the guilt and the shame about things that happened or didn't happen. Just my ability to meet my needs. And that's where you were focusing on is a veteran who can't get a job and who can't be housed. I was actually talking to somebody recently who was referring a colleague. It's really hard to talk about your inner child when you're wondering where you're sleeping tonight.
Yes.
So
oh
those,
my gosh, yes.
Not being able to meet our needs, and then the family situations, those are 4 areas that a veteran needs to be functional in, just as much as the PTSD symptoms and the emotional symptoms, substance abuse and TBI. And so looking at the entire comprehensive veteran mental health, that's where working with the mental health professional, as you said, getting somebody on your team. I have a mentor. I have a mentor that helps me, as a mental health professional. We have coaches. If you look at any high-powered executive, they have executive coaches that will come in and help them be better. The Winter Olympics is just finishing up. They didn't get there by themselves. They have an entire team to include coaches, and those coaches weren't polite to them all the time. They pushed them, and they got them to operate at a higher level. And that's where a veteran can benefit from working with a mental health counselor. But a lot of times they don't do that.
Yes, and I think that there's so many reasons, and you've discussed many on your podcast, that would be barriers for people. So, for example, in our state, if you are of working age, so still, pre-retirement, and if you are able-bodied, there are not resources for you for health care if you can't afford it yourself. And that's been a real issue with veterans who are transitioning, who maybe don't have access to VA services for whatever reason, whether it's their discharge status, and that's changing, thankfully. I'm really appreciative of that change to include OTHs for mental health treatment. But there are a lot of just logistical barriers to getting people care. And that's on top of the stigma, and that's on top of, a poverty of resources. So it's tough. And I would urge folks who are able to access services, you have a resource available to you to do that, to just go. The worst thing that happens is you get there and they tell you, gosh, everything is A-okay. You can keep seeing me if you want, but, you don't have any issues. I don't think that's ever happened, has that?
Well, and actually, it has. Interestingly enough, I talk about it on a recent show, episode 45, where I was talking to a veteran who, things maybe weren't going all that great, and we sat down and talked, and I was able to say, no, there is no PTSD or depression. Mm-hmm. There might be a couple little areas here and there, but it's not something that requires intensive treatment or anything like that. And I think that kind of thing is starting to emerge, but it is very, very uncommon. Typically, people will wait until there's a crisis, and a crisis has happened, and something has gone wrong in their life. Then they want to come in and sort of address it. But you're exactly right. Going in and getting just getting some awareness around how things are going, that it plays a huge role. And I applaud you for doing that for yourself, and then for advocating it for other veterans. I think that the only way that we're going to get beyond this is to really have these conversations out in the open.
Absolutely. And I would really attribute my being alive today to having an excellent counselor. In the mindset that you get in sometimes with depression, you're not thinking rationally. So my family who loved me, I didn't believe that they could possibly love me. My husband, who is super caring, I thought that I didn't deserve him. So when I'm in that low place, it really took an outside person, who was this trusted mental health professional that I had, to bring my attention to the really the falsehoods that I was buying into, the things that I was believing that were untrue. So even if you have a lovely and supportive family like I do, for me, in the mindset that my depression gets me in, I can't believe them. So I think that I really credit her with saving my life and keeping me accountable for how I'm feeling, because I'm inclined to want to report that I'm feeling very well. So once I worked with her long enough for her to observe that, she asked if she could put an extra level of accountability when she checks in with me about how I'm feeling. So I think that has been really crucial in my recovery, is having someone who really knows what's going on. And there's zero judgment for what's happening. There's validation, and there are concrete solutions and steps I can take to improve my situation. So I can't say enough good things about therapy, basically.
And I think, and you mentioned it earlier, that it is an anomaly that one would connect with the right person the first time. On one of the earliest shows, one of my fellow co-hosts, Jeff Adamek, he kind of tells his story of he didn't get to the right person until the third time. And that's very common, but a lot of veterans will stop at that first. Well, I tried, and then I ran against that wall, and they didn't get me, and then I stopped trying, and it's not going to work. Whereas that's a dangerous place to be as well.
It absolutely is, because when you lose faith in that individual, or just find that they're not working for you, please, I would beg people to not assume that that's what it's going to be like with everybody, because a therapeutic relationship is also, in a way, a personal relationship. It has a lot to do with personality. It has a lot to do with perspective. So if one person doesn't work for you, that's A-okay. There's no harm in, letting them go and finding someone new. And it can only benefit you to try someone new.
Well, and I think that's something that unique that veterans experience anyway, is that we tend to the first experience is indicative of the entire experience. Your first duty station, I think, was Georgia, you said?
My first duty station after training was Georgia. That's correct.
Was Georgia, right? It's very, very nice. I went to airborne school at Fort Benning. It's lots of good stuff. Perhaps it might have been different if your first duty station was Minot, North Dakota, right?
Exactly.
Or
Fort Polk, Louisiana.
Or Fort Polk, Louisiana. That was exactly in the Army. Or if it was 29 Palms for the Marines versus Camp Lejeune or San Diego, right? And so that's that initial impression is, well, this is the way the Army is, or the Air Force is, the military is, versus no, this, I have the ability to react to that, and I think that yours is a very great testimony, and I hope that veterans that are listening to this will actually kind of take it to heart and decide to maybe give it a shot.
Thank you, and I would also urge my fellow veterans not to not use a resource, and you have a blog on this, because you think that somebody else deserves it more than you. It took a former Marine buddy telling me that I was basically being stupid for not getting help. And the reason I wasn't getting help was that, well, I'm in the Air Force. I'm comfortably deployed. I have all the creature comforts that you could want. Why do I feel so rotten? And why would I get help when there's somebody right now who is, outside the wire or in a very, very remote fob in Afghanistan who is struggling and can't get help? And he told me, I've been that Marine. And I'm telling you, it doesn't matter where you are. It doesn't matter what you're doing. You feel how you feel. So it took that for me to finally embrace the antithesis to the myth of a poverty of resources. So definitely you don't have to have a combat trauma to need to reach out and bring someone onto your team to help you sort things out.
Absolutely. No, I really appreciate you coming on the show today, Rhi. I think this is a really good example of a veteran who didn't want to allow herself to be defined by the mental health challenges and really finding joy. So if people want to reach out to you, find out what you're doing, of course you're on Twitter, but where else are you at on social media?
You can find me on LinkedIn at Guzelian. You can also look at my website, which is www.hirerhi.com. And it's not fully up and running yet, but it's going to have a focus on love and service. Love being appreciation for the joyful things in our life, and service highlighting the people that are serving our communities with their skills. So I'm looking forward to getting that up and running, and you can connect with me any of those places.
Absolutely, and I'll make sure that all of those are on the show notes, which can be found at veteranmentalhealth.com and changeyourpov.com. Once again, thanks for coming on the show, Rhi.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. You're listening to Headspace and Timing on the Change Your POV Podcast Network. Well, I guess you never know where we're going to go with those conversations, right? I think Rhi said what a lot of veterans are thinking. We're tired of feeling this way, and we're going to do something about it. Rhi reached out to a mental health counselor, and it did her some good. Unfortunately, too many of our brothers and sisters are choosing a different thing to do, isolate and ultimately choose more destructive ways to deal with it. She mentioned during the show that she tried to do the transition thing backwards, produce the resume, get the job, and life will be great. It's not really going to be as good as it can possibly be until we figure out what's going on in our head, until we get our headspace and timing set correctly. That's our mission both on this show and on the Change Your POV Podcast Network, to address all aspects of transition: the mind, the heart, working hard, playing hard, and making our post-military life as good as it can possibly be. Rhi said it as good as I've said it before. We have the potential, veterans today have the potential, to either be this century's lost generation or this century's greatest generation. Each veteran has an individual choice as to which group they're going to belong to. If you like this show and want to get on the show to talk about one of your favorite Headspace and Timing blog posts, drop me a line at Dwayne@veteranmentalhealth.com. The only way we're going to change how we think and talk about veteran mental health is to get it out in the open, and I'd be happy to do that with you. Thanks again for taking the time to listen to the show. Now that you're here, make sure that you stick around by subscribing your podcast player of choice. You can find the show notes for this episode and all the episodes by going to veteranmentalhealth.com or changeyourpov.com. Sign up for updates on either or both so you don't miss another episode. While you're at it, check out the other great shows in the Change Your POV Podcast Network: Changing Hearts and Minds with my buddy Special Forces Weapons Sergeant Jeff Adamek, the show about outdoor adventures that us veterans love so much, Neophyte in the Woods with Andrew McDowell, and of course our flagship show hosted by Eddie Lazary and Bennett Tanton. As a matter of fact, if you go subscribe now, you'll be notified when Jeff Adamek and I talk about the Band of Brothers on the episode that's going to be released the day after this one. On that show, Jeff and I talk about the episode The Lost Patrol as part of his Band of Brothers Lessons in Leadership series. There's so much great stuff on all of these shows that you don't want to miss it. If you're looking for the total package for all the information you need to live the life you want to lead after leaving the military, you found it. I want to thank Doc Todd for his permission to use his track Not Alone from his amazing album Combat Medicine. Doc Todd is someone who's trying to bring veteran mental health out of the darkness and into the light, and you can get the album by going to www.therealdoctodd.com. Check it out, because remember, veterans, you're not alone. Ever.
The struggle is real, found a feast and lost a soul. Eventually my drinking, it got out of control. There in darkness I roam, struggling to find home. See, suddenly death didn't feel so alone. 22 a day, destination unknown. It could have been avoided if you picked up the phone, but now you're gone, so I guess all we get is the tone. Nothing but bone weeds, overgrown, pushing up stones. I've triumphed over enemies, co-created enemies. Broke out facilities that tried to put an end to me. R.I.P. I'd rather grind in tranquility. Authentic tendency, embrace my ability.
Oh, I try so hard to have faith. I bow my head and I pray. Lord, please lend me the strength to carry on and keep staying.
Stand up.
How this life so demanding. So much pain, I need plenty. I hurt each time I wait.
Tell 'em, man.
But with you, I'm not alone.
Not alone. You're not alone.
Ah, yeah. And every time that I fall, I'ma call on you. Get myself back up again.
Without my Georgia girls, yeah, I'd probably be dead. Cause I'd be taking every nail that the VA said. Gave every shred, every last thread of my identity. Conquer my fragility, eliminate the enemy. Deliver me, God, from temptation. Tell me that this life is just a matrix. Need a facelift, back to basics. Vision LASIX, I only feel alive when I hear the bass kick.
Oh, I try so hard to have faith. I bow my head and I pray.
Keep praying.
Lord, please lend me the strength to carry on and keep staying.
Stand up.
How this life so demanding. So much pain, I need plenty. I hurt each time I wait. But with you, I'm not alone.
Not alone. Yeah. You're not alone.
Oh, yeah. And every time that I fall, I'ma call on you. Pick myself back up again.
Yeah, just pick up the phone, you're not alone. Just pick up the phone, you're not alone, man. Just pick up the phone, you're not alone. Yeah, pick up the phone, I'm right here. And I love you guys. Take those bottles out, dog, and pour them in the sink. Take the needles out your arm and the gun away from your forehead. It's time, man, you've been through enough pain, stand up. It's time to stand back up. All my veterans, man, Army, Marine Corps, Navy, Air Force, Coast Guard. Get up, you know.
Oh, I try so